I think my interest in the film world is quite well known amongst my friends. It's probably my greatest passion, working on any kind of film. And I'd always heard about the great Stanley Kubrick, never thinking that I would ever work with him, but I got lucky. Let me tell you how that happened. They were going to make a film called The Luck of Barry Lyndon, starring Ryan O'Neill. And it is in the 17th century, and the story of Barry Lyndon is that he's a young man in Ireland who joined the army, through various misdeeds goes to prison, and then through gambling and womanizing he sort of works his way up the ladder to a different level, then travels abroad to Belgium, to England, to Germany and France, until he becomes friendly with aristocrats and very wealthy people. Still gambling, still womanizing. And this makes a very interesting film, which Stanley Kubrick had devised and written, and wanted to make it, and found a location in Ireland in a stately home. In fact, it was like a castle in huge grounds. And they needed a gambling advisor, and luckily I was recommended. But Stanley Kubrick has one peculiarity. He looks for the best people in their field, whether it's wardrobe, makeup, cameraman, electrician, plasterers, whatever. They have to be the best, but only if he feels he can work with them. And if he feels after an interview that he wouldn't be too happy with them, he will go for the second best. It's a strange, quirky thing, but that's what he does. So, of course, all of us who were interviewed by him felt extremely nervous, because it wasn't just the expertise, it was also personality. Well, I had to fly over to Ireland where they were filming, and I was told when I arrived he'd see me later that afternoon, and I waited in my room, and I waited, and I waited, and the call did not come until late in the evening, about 10:30 at night. Said, Mr. Kubrick is back now and he will see you in this room. They gave me the room number. I went to see him, very nervous, knocked on the door, expecting all kinds of technical questions on all the things that I'd researched on 17th century gambling. But the conversation took a strange direction, because he never asked me once about any of the things I'd learned. He asked me about myself, my background. We talked generally about psychology. We talked about chess, which is his great passion. Not once did he ask me about gambling or 17th century gambling. And after 2 hours, we said goodnight. It was a very pleasant evening. I was not told if I'd got the job. I flew back to London. I then went on a holiday with my family. And it's only when I came back that I got the good news that yes, I would be the gambling advisor for this film. So again, I flew to Dublin to work with Stanley Kubrick. There's one particular episode which I will never forget. First of all, Stanley Kubrick had managed to get a special lens from NASA, the space agency, which was the only one, well, in fact there were two, one for NASA themselves and one that he managed to either borrow or hire, I'm not sure which. This lens had the ability to have somebody in focus who was quite near the camera, and somebody who was far away was also in focus. Quite remarkable. With that, he was filming a gambling scene in a private home with various tables with gamblers around. He was looking through the lens one day. I often stood next to him, and then he asked me to look through the camera once in a while to see what I thought of that shot. And this time he said, "David, have a look at that man at the far end. What is he holding?" So I said, "Well, he's keeping score." He said, "But what is he holding?" I said, "Well, I gave him a very small silver pencil, a very, very small, less than 2 inches, a propelling pencil, which he was keeping score." He said, "That's exactly it. said they didn't have that kind of pencil in those days. So even though it was a long way away, he was such a perfectionist that he could spot there was something wrong. And I was quite embarrassed and had to change it to something else. And that happened throughout the film, that people who thought they'd done a wonderful job on the costumes or the set, there was always something that he could find that he didn't find correct. And of course the other problem was that we were filming everything by candlelight. That caused various problems. One was that the candle wax would drip onto the costumes and the wigs of the actors, which had to be scraped off in between shots. And the other thing is that the candles would be slightly smaller, so they had to be replaced and measured exactly so that the next shot would match up. It was a bit of a nightmare because we were using huge chandeliers, side brackets and individual candles that all had to be changed every few minutes. And he was insistent that the whole film would be shot by candlelight. And of course the end result was fantastic. Every shot looked like a Rembrandt painting. But it did cause a lot of problems. And only once did he actually use some diffuse spotlights into the roof, which reflected the light just enough to be able to get the shot that he wanted. There were other things happening because we recruited some local people to be dressed as soldiers, and they were given rifles or muskets, which were very long rifles, actually pieces of wood carved and painted, and the bayonets were pointed down that had been put on top and painted silver. They looked very real, but of course they were fake. The straps were made of white webbing, which made it look even more authentic. But one night, the Irish Republican Army broke in and stole a whole truck full of these rifles thinking they were real. Well, unfortunately, that panicked Stanley Kubrick. He was a bit of a physical coward. He didn't like flying in planes. He didn't like driving fast in cars. So he stopped all the filming because of that, and we had to move back to England to find a location to match up to the Irish countryside where we'd been filming, and we found Salisbury Plain to finish the film up in Salisbury Plain just because of that one episode. Now Stanley would spend a whole year editing, but he mostly did it by himself with one or two assistants. He had a beautiful house between Barnet and Elstree. All the stables had been turned into garages, and when he bought the house, the garages were turned into editing suites.
And it was full of Steenbeck editing tables and monitors. Stanley was in here all the time, and his cats would come in and sit on editing tables, and this was his favourite room.
And I was very privileged. I went a couple of times. Not many people were allowed to go there. I had to deliver something or find out something, and he asked me to come and do it myself. And so I saw him actually in the editing suite. An interesting story, what a recluse he was, is that I had a secretary who worked for me for 9 years, and purely by chance, she used to play bridge with Stanley Kubrick's wife. And she went there either once a week or sometimes once a fortnight to play bridge, and during that time she saw Stanley only once. One day he popped his head round the corner of the door and asked his wife something, and that's all she ever saw of him, because he spent all his time in the editing suite. So he was a real recluse, a real perfectionist, and it was a real privilege and a great experience to be able to work alongside a man like Stanley Kubrick.